Welcome to the St. Louis University Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Awards series of programming with our host, Ted Iber, and special guest, David Keplinger. The St. Louis Literary Award was created by the Library Associates of St. Louis University in 1967. To learn more about the Literary Award and the writers that we have honored over the years, check out the book The St. Louis Literary Award by St. Louis University Archivist Emeritus John Wade. We would also like to thank our sponsors for the Craft Talks series, Left Bank Books and Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company. Left Bank Books is one of the oldest and largest independently owned bookstores in the nation, offering a full line of new and used books, gifts, cards, magazines, toys, and services. You can order David Keplinger works at a 20% discount if you let them know that you saw this interview. Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company is dedicated to creating a memorable coffee experience for their customers and guests, committing to sustainable business practices, providing educational opportunities, and supporting the communities in which they serve. And now, without further ado, David Keplinger.
Welcome to St. Louis University's Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Award series of programs. My name is Ted Iber, and I am the Executive Director of the St. Louis Literary Award. I would like to welcome David Keplinger to Craft Talks. David, welcome.
Well, thank you, Ted. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. Since we lined this up months ago, it's been really fun reading your work and learning a lot about you. And I just mentioned to you before we started rolling the camera that I had a panic attack about forgetting to record. So we are recording. At least I guess we'll find out soon enough if we are. All right, a little bit about you. David is a professor of literature in the MFA program at American University in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 5 collections of poetry, including the new book, The Long Answer, published by Stephen F. Austin State University Press. David has been awarded many literary honors over the years for his works. He's a recipient of the UNT Rilke Prize, the Colorado Book Award, the Cavafy Prize from Poetry International, the Erskine Prize from Smartish Pace. The great poet Mary Oliver awarded David the T.S. Eliot Prize for his book of poetry, The Rose Inside. And David Keplinger has received not 1, but 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts. These are just some of the many accolades received by my guest today. So congratulations, David, on an already stellar career and on the publication of The Long Answer. So I thought we would kick it off by reading the title poem from The Long Answer, if you have it handy.
I do. I have it right here.
Great.
The Long Answer. It's now so late, the 2 men seated in the middle of the frozen escalator on Connecticut Avenue, underground, can take their time to weld the one thing to another thing, anonymous and slow. Their heads almost touch. The sun's surface flash of the rod is not to be gazed into. In their masks, they resemble the gods at Easter Island, as under the stairs I see a small hatch has been opened where the guts of the moving treadmill are exposed. They say nothing to each other. They stare down at the work of making things work. They will not even show their surprise when the slats, one folding out of the next, begin to rise as steps that they will open to us, that we will ride into the dome of summer, like the answer to a question so old no one can say what was asked in the first place, and which leaves us on the tip of night's tongue, sleepy and arriving in waves of heat with only each other on Connecticut Avenue, come out from underground.
Beautiful. Well done. Love it.
Thank you.
And personal connection to me, my very first house I ever owned was on Connecticut Avenue.
So many have the same story. In fact, I lived on Connecticut Avenue for many years myself.
At what point, just off the top of my head, at what point did you know that that was going to be the title piece, and the name of your book?
I wrote that piece and then came up with the title afterwards. So the piece preceded the title for the book. But this idea of the answer to a question so old, we don't know what was asked in the first place, I guess became a theme that helped me to assemble finally all of the poems. Once that poem was written and I had the title, I realized that there was an order that was possible for this collection. It's my selected poems over 20 years. Mm-hmm.
There's new pieces in here too, though, right?
There are about 30 pages of new poems at the end of the book, this being one of them. But that sense of a kind of continuous answer, like that escalator, you know, the steps disappearing and more steps appearing and more steps appearing. And the way that the book leaves us with only each other without any meaning per se, but this connectedness that is suddenly possible thanks to these two workers, like these gods at Easter Island. So it felt right to me first to conclude the book that way, and also to arrange the book so that the heavy seeking meaning poems from my early career were at the beginning, and then the more imagistic and surreal poems from my later career happened at the end. And those poems at the end of my career, or not the end, but the most recent poems of my career, I hope, are all about putting unlikely things side by side and creating relationships. Like the people coming up this escalator who don't know each other, but have a relationship merely by the space that contains them. Mm-hmm. And that's how I write poems now. I just place unlikely things side by side, and I wait to see what will happen.
At what point, or no, not at what point, just how long did it take you to figure out the order of how the poems were going to go for this?
It's a very good question and a very hard thing to answer because I have very little memory of it. I think, first of all, I knew that the earliest book was going to be at the beginning and the latest book would be at the end. But then to choose 10 or 15 pages from each book was more difficult than I imagined it would be. Only because I wanted to choose the best poems, but I also wanted the poems to correlate in a way that would connect them book by book over those 20 years of writing time. So I had to leave some poems out that I liked, but which didn't quite belong with the rest of the poems. They didn't have that same consistency of voice. So that was one thing.
Just like putting together when you've got an album of songs, for instance, you're wanting that there's a flow and a vibe that everything gels together from start to finish.
Right. It's like the mixtape. You know, you want to come in strong, you want to go soft, you want to come back strong, but you don't want to have a lot of poems that are very similar in a row, especially book to book, because you have to imagine, even though the book is 165 or 170 pages, you have to imagine that someone would read it from beginning to end as you intended. And what would their experience be like if it were the same type of poem or the same voice page after page? So I wanted some longer poems mixed in with the shorter ones and to create the flow of an album, just as you describe it, until the end. And then as I was writing the new poems, I had that in mind. And I had the advantage of knowing what would precede those poems by 140 pages to actually have those talk to the earlier poems, which was an interesting project too. It was like I had a preconceived form for the book, and then I had to write the last 3 lines of this sonnet. And how would I do that? How would I wrap it all up?
Okay, so I've got some questions for you on writing process. Yeah. And I so wish I could just memorize these and not read them off a sheet, but I'll be reading them. So you're a world traveler. Your blog, Prosperous Departures, includes reflections on traveling to find communities of writers over 5 continents. In one post, you include pictures of desks at which you've worked in various locations. And I have to say, from a personal perspective, I love looking at other artists' spaces. I find that fascinating. Can you talk about your writing process and what you've gotten from working in different locations at different tables? And related, do you feel more inspired when you're traveling?
I do. Not everybody does. And this is not to say that it's the ultimate answer to your question, because I think for somebody else, like Emily Dickinson, my great influence, the master of all poetry of the 19th century, 20th century and beyond, in my opinion, staying at home was the way in. But for me, traveling has been an important part of what Robert Bly calls one's cunning. Robert Bly talks about the craft of writing poetry by dividing it into three movements. The first movement, what does he call it, is the experience of the interior. When you're young, you have this experience that you're looking out at the world and everything is looking back at you. This mystical moment where you feel connected to everything else, but you don't yet have the words to describe it. And then you get older and you decide to become a poet and you tap back into that experience of the interior and you write your first good poem. Then you have that poem and it's like you have to start all over because you realize that you've tapped into something with that good poem that the others were just barely touching upon. So how do you get back to that moment which you got to the first time by accident? And he calls that your experience of cunning. So the cunning in my process is going back to those tables that you were describing over and over again in different places and re-experiencing that solitude. So the solitude for me is extremely important. Again, Emily Dickinson could experience it at home, although there were people there and there was lots of noise and lots of familiarity. For me, I like to go to a place where there's no familiarity and very few people and not a lot of noise except for what's out there in nature. And as I said in an interview earlier this week, a lot of times the writing doesn't happen in that experience of solitude. It happens after I return, paradoxically. But something gets turned on for me. And I remember something that I'd forgotten in my busy days at school, writing emails and counseling students and teaching classes. I forget something. And then I go back into this experience of the solitude, the remoteness, and I remember it again. And then the gears slowly start to turn. And then just to finish the thought, the third realm of craft for Robert Bly was what he called, in his Robert Bly-ish way, letting the animal live. Letting the animal live was to get out of the poem's way and to allow it to be the poem that it was born to be without imposing some idea of what poetry with a capital P should look like.
I love that. Yeah, that's such great advice for students too.
Yeah, it is, because they have this idea that poetry is supposed to rhyme or not rhyme, or poetry is supposed to be emotional, or poetry is supposed to have deep thoughts and wisdom. But really, poetry is supposed to be an honest transcription of where you are and who you are at that moment in your life. So for me, the traveling does do that. It brings me back to that space again and again. And I often go to a different space. Those tables that you were describing, one of them is in Japan, another one in the Czech Republic, another one in France, one in Greece. So I've had the advantage of having the time to take those trips, sometimes month-long retreats into solitude.
I have to say I'm fascinated by that idea of solitude and writing. It's certainly different for every writer. I think of Pulitzer Prize winner Richard Russo, who says that he needs to write in crowded cafes because he doesn't like the solitude of his office. He needs to be out there in public, and he likes being interrupted and the clang of silverware and the hustle and bustle of what's going on around him. Michael Schulman, who likes having music blasting from his Mac in front of him. That's inspiring for him.
It's different for everybody, but I want to say, to echo Russo, I feel that way too. And sometimes I'll go with a pen and a pad to a cafe, and I also like the sound of people around me in that context too. So there's a range of it for everybody. It's not just one thing. For me, that clang of the glasses and the plates and everything, something I really miss right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic, is important because it threatens your moment and it makes the moment all the more focused upon. Like there's this undistracted, deep attunement that happens when you know at any moment somebody could come along and trip or talk to you or interrupt you. So you want to get it down while you have it. And that's important too.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it seems like a good time to ask about what does a typical day of writing look like for you? And I know
these days,
right? Saying there's nothing typical right now.
Right. These days, a typical day of writing for me is starting in the morning, and I would say writing for an hour, and usually that right now it involves revising, but a couple of months ago it involved writing a poem a day for a few weeks at a time, and then falling back into the revising mode, and then back into the generation mode. And sometimes if I can't generate new poems, and I know that something in me tells me that I should be, I'll use forms or a sequence prompt to get me started. And then I'll write another poem in the sequence day after day after day. But then it happens that you run out of gas, and instead of just writing bad poems continuously, I'll stop when I feel like that part of it, the generative part of it, is over, and I'll go into the revisions. And that's always helpful for me too. In fact, in this book, The Long Answer, there are a number of revisions, maybe 5 or 10 revisions of older poems. And it might just be a line, or it might be a period where there wasn't one before, but they seem important to me. And it was really neat to go back to my earlier poems from the mid-90s and move things around a little bit and see what would happen.
One of the things that I talk to my students about time just over and over again is the joy of revision. And I will try to not address this too much again later on. I know it's a question I've got for you later, but I just, for a lot of younger writers, they feel that once they've got that rough draft written, that first draft, they're done. I don't care if it's a classroom essay or if it's a work of fiction or creative nonfiction. And I try to really impart upon them that the revision part is the most joyous part of writing. That's where you can really begin to make some serious magic happen. And it's a process.
What is that magic for you?
With revision? Well, It's kind of like what you said. Anytime that I go back into a piece that I've been working on, I'm always amazed by how much I find, whether it's content or whether it's even just it's mechanics or grammar. I can't believe that there are things that I'll look at a week later that somehow went by me on that last look. It blows me away, but it happens every time.
Do you do crossword puzzles? This happens to me when I'm doing a crossword puzzle.
I used to, yeah.
So you struggle over this word. What is it? What could it be? Then you put it down, you come back to it a few hours later, and then there it is suddenly. But it's the same for me. I'm shocked and embarrassed by what I miss. And when I'm looking at it too often. So that's why it's good to do the first draft and put it away for a couple of weeks, and then look at it fresh as if somebody else had written it.
Yes.
Coming back to it fresh like that, you get to see your own work in a way that you wouldn't if you were so invested in it, to say that this is my latest poem. It's got to be a sign that I'm either getting better or getting worse. But you have to let go of all of those investments in your latest poem, because it's not the measure of who you are as a poet. It's what I tell my students all the time, because they take it so seriously, and then they take it personally when something goes wrong in workshop. So having those new poems, that you wrote yesterday, workshopped tonight, is not a great idea, because you're still too wrapped up in it, and you'll get your feelings hurt.
Sure. And you also have to be willing, and this is something that's challenging, I think, for any writer, and that's the willingness to let some things go, things that you think were great when you wrote them, and still may feel that they're great, but they just don't really jive with this particular piece. So they may have to be just put over for future use with something else. That's hard.
It's hard, but it's so productive, a process. When you put that stuff aside, immediately it didn't belong. You sense it, and you're afraid to let it go, because you think, when I take this block out of the building, the whole thing is going to collapse. But as soon as it's gone, you realize that never belonged. And it can be used for something else, or it can be its own poem often.
Sure.
I'm, a big fan of the short poem. Sometimes you have short poems that are contained in the longer ones, 2 or 3 of them that could be taken out and placed somewhere else.
Yeah, I love that. So you said,
go ahead.
No, I was going to move on. So if you've got another thought with that, I'm changing subjects.
Okay.
Okay. So you said your poem Wave about Lincoln's farewell took 7 years to write. Elegy for the Precious Time Before Dinner, you said, incubated for several years and then came together in a matter of 10 minutes. It does relate to what we were talking about. Would you read both poems and then elaborate a bit more on these quotes?
Okay, will do. Shall I read them in a row, Ted?
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, if you would.
Okay. Elegy for the Precious Time Before Dinner. Along the fringe of 2 known worlds, of field, of prison yard, behind the house my mother and her sisters live in. This was years ago. We're all still there, itinerant as wind, the straits of corn and prison guards who pace their impossible promontories, and the small mouse just born into this world, total as a thumb. With her sisters who are dead, my mother is a beauty, taking the spoon to beat the dog away from the pot, at which they all begin to laugh. Little beetles with a kind of Viking armor. I want to smash you, smash the spiders atop their pagodas like bad thoughts. Smash the crazy locust who won't abandon its post. At the house, the women happily eye up the sauce about to boil. I'm wearing my emblematic cape. I can fly at any moment if I want to, but I don't. And then this is the poem Wave, which appeared in my 5th collection called Another City. Wave. Lincoln, leaving Springfield, 1861, boards a train with a salute, but it's weak. To correct it, he slides his hands away from his face as if waving, as if brushing the snows of childhood from his eyes. The train is coming east. In the window, Lincoln watches his face. You'll grow old the moment you arrive, he says to this face. But you'll never reach great age. The train speeds like the cortical pressure wave in the left lateral sinus, say, a bullet in the skull. Then he will have his salute. Then they will love him. Then eternity will slow, fall like snow. Then the treaty with huge silence, which he, his face exhausted, must sign.
Those are gorgeous. So getting back to the quote, one took years, one seemed to come together in minutes. Can you talk about that?
Wave, as I was reading it, I was tracing it back in my mind. Where did all of this begin? And it's really interesting. It started around 2005 when in Pueblo, Colorado, where I was living at the time, I was teaching at Colorado State Pueblo, a little school out on the plains in southeastern Colorado. Wonderful place, wonderful people, great time in my life. And they had a library sale. Then the library was selling these old books that nobody was checking out anymore. And one was the early speeches of Lincoln. And it was about that thick. And in the back was a card. And someone named something like Michael McDougall had checked the book out in 1917. That was the last time the book had been checked out. And the last speech in that little collection was Lincoln leaving Springfield for his inauguration in 1861. And it says something like, I now leave, and I don't know when I'll see you again. And so I imagine, the next time he'll see them all again or be with them all again is when his tomb is built, and when he comes by train back west. And Whitman writes, when lilacs last in the dooryard bloom. So it's such a profound little phrase for me. It just haunted me. And I'm sure you know this too, and your students know this, at least intuitively, that it's the stuff that haunts us that keeps calling to us and asking us to figure it out. Why is this haunting you and not something else? Well, that's where the poem becomes a form, a place to a forum to understand what it is that haunts you. So about this phrase. And so I started to write it, and I got to Michael McDougall, and I quoted the speech, but it wasn't right. It had the snows of childhood. It had some of the other things that were in this poem. But what I ultimately realized, apropos of our earlier statement, is that Michael McDougall had nothing to do with it. It got me to this place of feeling haunted by Lincoln, but it didn't really have anything to do with what was calling me about the poem. So I took him out, and I took out 1917 because it was confusing. And I said, maybe I'll save that for another poem. And then this thing came together. But it was years before that happened. I had this poem in an earlier collection, trying to make it work. And that collection got published, but this poem was pulled from it. And then I set it aside and came back to it when another city was contracted, and it worked. It's now one of my favorite poems in the book, but it took a long time.
I love that you went back to it after it had already been in publication form. I think that's really important. And I do think writers do that. I know musicians do it, but you and I were speaking earlier off camera about John Updike, and I think about him, who was renowned for going back and continuing to work on things that he never intended on anyone seeing beside himself. He just wanted to revise because as an artist, he just wanted to make it better.
Right. What's your experience with this? Mine is that people get angry with me when I revise older poems and put them in the selected, or even take an older poem and put it in a newer book, but in a slightly different form.
I love it. I wouldn't, as I said, I think more people should do it.
I feel like it's like a cover, right? It's like a cover. Since we're on the music metaphor, it is like doing a cover of a song. You never want to do the same cover a second time. You always want to bring something else to it. So maybe, and Whitman, of course, did this over the course his entire career, from 1855 until his death in the 1890s. He was revising his poems all the time. And people were more faithful to the 1855 collection than they were to the, I think it's 1892 collection. But he didn't care about that. He wanted to re-engage with these poems over and over again, because each time he published Leaves of Grass, it was like he was publishing it for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and boy, I'm showing my cards here by continuing to refer to music, because I'm a musician as well. But I think of a band like Radiohead, a band that I love both lyrically and musically, who often play around with the music that they've recorded versus the way that they perform it live.
Right.
It's more interesting for the band, and often for the audience too.
Yeah, I think so too. And Dylan is the ultimate example of that. He changes songs constantly. So having a success with a poem doesn't necessarily mean that it's finished, I guess, is the takeaway. That it's only finished in the sense that it's been printed onto a piece of paper and bound by two pieces of cardboard and sent out into the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the poem is finished. Absolutely. For me, it's always evolving. So the other question you had was about Elegy for the Precious Time Before Dinner, and why that came so quickly. It's hard to say. Sometimes they do. They come out in one draft and then they're finished. But I think what happened here is that I came up with the title first, and I liked the title so much that it made writing the poem quite easy. And what I was reading two poets at the time, really faithfully. One was Charles Simic, and the other one was Seamus Heaney. And, you know, with Heaney, there is this formality that I wasn't as much interested in as I was the feeling of violence, even in the smallest context, like a child sitting in the field, playing in between the prison and the house, and not knowing what's happening in the prison to a certain extent, but only imagining with horror, and then also not knowing what's happening in the house, but imagining with horror because his two aunts are dying. And being in that between place felt like a Northern Ireland kind of setting. And then with Simic, there was a formality in Simic that I really still very much enjoy, which is that stanzaic pattern and the full stop at the end of each stanza and the kind of quietness that can produce. So I had those writers in my mind. And at this time, when I was writing this book, it was my second book called The Clearing. There were a lot of clearings in that book, and this is one of them. So when I was writing this book, I was really, really interested in that quietness, that a stanzaic pattern and full stops and line breaks that are completely natural without a lot of enjambments could produce. So I had all of that going on, and a title that I liked and an idea, and the poem came together, and I didn't need to go back to it. But it's a little bit like winning the lottery. You know, you have to play the lottery a lot of times before you hit one of those. And if you're doing it every time in your own opinion, you're probably not correct. It has to feel like a huge surprise if you get it right the first time, and then you come back to it a couple of weeks later and it still looks good to you. But it does happen now and then.
I love that you were talking about your immersion with Simic and Heaney. It's kind of like being in grad school with and for yourself.
Yeah.
You know, where you're learning so much, you're absorbing so much, but you're not transmitting their work as your own, but you're obviously influenced by it. And it just speaks to the importance of reading other people's work and constantly learning from it, no matter what level you're at.
I don't know how it was for you, but for me, the real learning happened after graduate school. When I decided that this was going to be my life, I really took to it. In graduate school, I wasn't sure, and I didn't take it as seriously, I have to say, as I could have, but I was really young. I was only 23, 24 years old when I was in graduate school. But then after that, I left the country for lack of a job, and I got a little teaching job thanks to the Soros Foundation in Eastern Europe. And I was really out there in that place of solitude. And in fact, with Cunning over the years, I'm really kind of returning to that experience over and over again of being 25 and living abroad. But yeah, the serious work began there. I only had a few books with me. One of them was, you know, Charles Simic. Another one was Louise Glick. A Stephen Crane collection of short stories. I mean, I really only brought a few books with me. And then I realized when I got there that there were no books to be had. And I don't know why I didn't think to ask somebody to mail me some, but the mail was so slow. I just gave up on the idea and read the same books over and over again, 100 Years of Solitude. And it actually worked that way. It was like taking a graduate class on 4 collections. And I just kept reading them and memorizing passages. And you know what, Ted? Those passages still come up in my work unconsciously. So something was happening there. I was planting seeds that bore fruit for a long time.
That's so funny that you bring up Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. It was the first thing I read after graduate school as well. Wow. and got completely immersed in Milan Kundera at the time too. And I was so inspired by 100 Years of Solitude. I was trying to write a percussion piece based on the music. Wow. Didn't really go anywhere, but I was inspired enough to do it. And I'm amused and I love the fact that particular novel is often taught now in advanced writing or literature classes in high school.
Yeah, right.
Challenging book.
And I wonder if Unbearable Lightness of Being is still being taught, but that was also a huge influence on me. In fact, it got me to the Czech Republic.
Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah, I love Kundera's work. He's a little revisionist history. I think he's taken a knock right now publicly, but
yeah,
for maybe some of the things he's written or said, but it is a book that would definitely ranks in one of at least my top 20.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so let me ask you this: what kind of planning goes into your writing? You've definitely addressed this somewhat.
When you say planning, do you mean research?
I do mean research. And I probably should have asked you this when I asked you about a typical day.
That's a funny question for me because I don't do research necessarily for this writing. I do other kinds of writing where research is involved, essays and things like that. But for my poems, often what I'll do is immerse myself in a subject. Like we were talking about Seamus Heaney. You're probably familiar with North, his book North from the early 70s, which is a kind of metaphorical treatment of the Troubles. And what he's talking about are these bog people who are dredged up after World War II. All of these corpses from the Iron Age were being discovered in the peat because people were using it more for energy sources. After World War II, everyone was so impoverished, they started going out into the fields and digging up the peat. Mm-hmm. And these corpses had been down there underneath the peat and preserved by the tannins in the bog for thousands of years, and they were mistaken for the recently dead. They were so well preserved. So he started to write these poems about these bog people. They came to be known. When I read that book, I was completely sold. And in fact, I've been to various museums throughout Northern Europe where these bog people are presented, like at the British Museum and in Jutland, especially where the Tolland man is and the Graball man. And it's just fascinating to me. So I can see why he would get caught up in that. But what made it interesting in 1972 was this connection with the Troubles, and how in one, I think it's a poem called Punishment, he says he if he were there watching this happen, this execution, he would have stood and said nothing. He would have cast the stones of silence, he says. So this acknowledgement of the violence of the past being represented in the violence of the present, and how he feels a little guilt about standing in between so much in his political writing, or his non-political writing, I guess you would say. So the book was a means for him to express those feelings of guilt, and also the feeling of just cultural national sadness. So that involved his going into the library and doing a lot of research. I'm interested in the Iron Age too. In fact, I have a lot of poems in my new collection that are connected to a place called Yakutia in Siberia, and the animals that have been frozen under the permafrost for 40,000 years that are now being found just lying on the ground because the permafrost is melting there so rapidly. So it's this evidence of the Ice Age that we've never seen before. I'm really interested in that. So I do research on Yakutia. I think about it a lot. I save pictures of these animals, and then I go back and I write about them, but I don't use facts from the article. In fact, I don't have any articles or any material nearby when I'm doing the writing, because I want those things to organically come to the surface as they're needed, rather than implanting facts and images into a poem just to show that I've done the research. So for me, the poem is like dreaming. I spend the day looking at these images. I think about this stuff. I'm fascinated with this subject right now. And then I go to sleep at night, and then they come as they're needed. And it happens that way when I'm consciously writing at the kitchen table too. They kind of just come in when they're needed, and then they go away when they're not.
You mentioned in a December 2019 interview that you encourage your students to find their own uniqueness of voice and not necessarily repeat things that have already been done just for the sake of form. So I've got several how questions coming your way.
Yeah, sure.
How do you approach a poetic form, and how is it important to you in your creative process?
Well, there are fixed forms, traditional forms that everyone recognizes. Sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, ghazals, the list goes on and on. We're all pretty good readers of poetry when it comes to acknowledging, oh, there's a sonnet. We just look at it on the page. And so the poem has a visual meaning. We talk about the oral meaning of the poem. We talk about the rhetorical meaning, but there's also a visual meaning when you're looking at a sonnet, because you're suddenly flung back to a tradition that's 500, 600, 700 years old. I think the earliest sonnets were written in Sicily in the 13th century.
Right.
So this, and Joseph Brodsky says that forms carry with them spiritual magnitudes, that forms already mean just by their shape on the page. And then we're going in there and we're adding material to those forms by filling them up. And they're having a conversation with those spiritual magnitudes, which have been carried along with the sonnet since the 13th century. So that's one way of writing in form. And it's a very productive thing for me, because the form does a lot of the work. I'm not there trying to reinvent the wheel. I've got this sonnet now that's doing half of the work, and it's a beautiful engine. And then I find the subject matter that's going to converse with it. The other way of writing in forms is to invent your own. And that's something I love to do as well. And I think it's becoming more and more popular. The golden shovel, new forms, the bop form that are being written and talked about quite a lot today in contemporary American poetry. I first did this in a book called The Most Natural Thing, where I had a collection of poems that were all 9 lines of prose and then exact squares ending, where the square ends. And so it did a lot of work for me. I don't know why 9 lines. It didn't have any kind of, numerological significance, but it just seemed right. All my poems seem to be around that length. So why not make it 9 lines of prose? And so the poems aren't broken, but they're prose poems, but there's a hand there at work that's showing some kind of intention. And the fact that it's a square and the book is called The Most Natural Thing is already a conversation, because a square isn't natural. I mean, a square is the most unnatural thing, a perfect square at least. And so the poems were about the organs of my body, and then they were put into this space that was like an X-ray of analysis. And they were having a conversation. So whatever you're doing with form, whether you're inventing it yourself or you're using a fixed form, or even if you're trying to free yourself from form by writing a prose paragraph, a prose poem is really all about freedom, liberation from standards and forms. Whatever you're doing on the page, you're making a choice, and that's a form. And unless you're just randomly allowing the computer to decide, and it shows when you're doing that. So you make this choice, and then that choice is ultimately always going to have a conversation with the stuff that you use to fill it up. The writing itself, the language, the sounds of the words, the images, the stories that you tell, the stuff that you don't tell. All that stuff is in conversation with the shape of the thing, or the way that the lines come together, or maybe they extend like this on the page. That's what Whitman's doing, and it's free verse, but it's also a form because there's a choice involved. So that's what I tell the students. Yeah.
And just to elaborate on that a little bit, one of the things that I particularly find with newer writers is that form, they're initially intimidated by it. They find it restricting, and I have to try to sell them on the idea that in fact form can be liberating. Because the structure is already solid, and that you have to work within the confines of that. And there's some magic that can happen when you're working within specific forms. And to your point, even making up your own forms, I think I agree with you. I think that that's a trend that seems to be more recent, at least more on my radar now. And that can be a lot of fun for writers. And if they feel like there's a certain monotony to only following the forms that are hundreds of years old, and they want to break from that and try something different, what a great time to be doing that.
It really is the time to be doing that. Back in the early 90s, there was a whole new formalist movement. And there are plenty of those writers who are still going strong, like A.E. Stallings and Dana Gioia. But their emphasis was on, the power of rhyme and the power of iambic pentameter and the power of those fixed forms with their spiritual magnitudes. Let's go back to those. But now the idea of what form is and what it can be in a poem, and how all poems, in a way, have to have it. As much as a turn in a poem is important, a form in a poem is important too. But it's really a much wider sphere of possibility now than it used to be. And I celebrate that. And I do agree too that a form is liberating. And the students will say, how is that possible when a form restricts? The form is making you make choices. But imagine that your house is on fire and you're looking around the house. You know exactly what you want to take with you when the house is on fire, because you don't have a lot of time, and it's choices that are happening at this, split second level. But you take the stuff that's most precious and you leave the rest. But when you're not writing with any kind of restriction, it's like having a mansion and you just don't know what is important and what isn't important. The form comes in and it says, no, you have to decide. And what you discover is that you already know what you need in this poem and what isn't needed. So it really does help you to make the right decisions, I guess you could say.
Stealing that house metaphor from you, by the way.
Take it.
All right, so moving on to a little music. In describing, well, actually, this isn't music. This is, you'll see. In describing the strong image content in your poems, you've mentioned that you love to think about images, turn them around in your head, and discover things about yourself by describing things with a lot of tension. So I've got two questions here. I'll get to the music part later. What are your strategies to infuse tension in your work? And what role can poetry play in the process of self-discovery for you or the reader?
Yeah, that's a big question. For tension, that's an easier one to answer. I find that the tension between clarity and mystery, between what's said and what's not said, is one of the central missions of my poems. Not everybody's poems, but speaking for myself, it's this tension between what is given and what is withheld. Mm-hmm. And a poem can be mysterious, but very clear. And another thing that I often tell the students is that there's a difference between a poem being confusing and a poem being mysterious. When it's confusing, it's like we don't know what we're supposed to be looking at. But if it's mysterious, I know exactly what I'm looking at, but the reasons behind this thing being there, or the relationship between this thing and another and why it should haunt me, are left for me to mull after the poem is over. And this I learned from Charles Simic. Having a few images, very spare images, Simic says a poem doesn't need more than 2 or 3 really strong images. Don't load them up. Don't stack them one on top of the other, because they'll be competing with each other. But just have a few really strong images that are side by side without explaining them whatsoever, and leave the rest to the reader. Mm. And that produces tension. A lot of times with the prose poems, what I'll do is I'll have a long sentence, and then I'll have a short sentence and another short sentence, and then 3 long sentences, and then I'll end it with a couple of short sentences. And that sounds really mundane, but it's a form, and it actually works to produce that kind of heightened tension at the end of the poem, so that readers get the cue musically that this is coming to an end. thing is, it's just really hard to create a work of art in 14 lines or in 9 lines of prose. It's really hard to get all of the stuff that all art has to have, which is a rising sense of tension or conflict or suspense, a turn that happens at the end, a sense of the familiar and a sense of the strange, all in one poem. And you could do it in 3 lines if you're the master, but it's really tough. So these little devices that we invent for ourselves as we go along aren't so much that we look original to the reader. They're just our own way of answering these questions. How am I going to make it look familiar and strange? How am I going to have a turn at the end? And how am I going to have this rising suspense? Am I going to do it musically? Will I do it with images? Will I do it with mystery? Will I do it by saying the clear thing? What Gregory Orr says is that all poems have to have, I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's wonderful. They have to sing, they have to describe well, they have to name things, and they have to say things. So saying, singing, imagining, and naming are the functions of every poem. And how you do that then is up to you. But what he did was the same as me. He came up with his own way of thinking about it and said, okay, this is what I'm going to demand of each of my poems. Is it there or is it not there? And if it's not, how can I make it so? And I'm doing the same. So for me, tension has a lot to do with the musicality of the lines and the sentences, and with the way that I mount the few images in the poem, one on top of the other. Oh, and then the other question, could you repeat that one?
Sure. It is. What role can poetry play in the process of self-discovery?
I mean, it's everything. What I would say to that is that when I started writing, I thought I had something to say. And in the course of 30 years of writing poetry, I realized that the poems slowly began to talk to me. And I began to discover things about an inner self that I didn't know existed when I was 23, 24 years old. I thought I wanted to tell some stories about my family and to write like Philip Levine, but that was not to be the case. I started to write, and what I started to notice about what was coming over and over again on the page was that this was an unfamiliar person. Who was this that was speaking back to me in the form of a poem? And then the poems mount one on top of the other over years and years and years, and you become a better listener. And my friend Kermit Moyer says that true listening is a willingness to change. If you're really listening, like in a workshop, you've got to be at least a little willing to change your mind. And slowly, if you're listening to the poems, slowly, they make you change your mind. And things that you thought were true when you were 23 then become the opposite of truth when you're, in your 50s. So I owe poetry everything for self-discovery. And I really don't know who I'd be if I didn't make the choice of, undertaking this writing life those years ago. I don't know if I would, if I knew how hard it would be. But I definitely am a different person, or I have discovered that person that I really am, thanks to poetry.
Yeah. So is guitar your primary instrument?
Yeah. Oh, you saw that. Yeah.
So what inspired you to set your great-great-grandfather's Civil War era poetry to music, and how has the message changed or heightened as an album, or a musical album, as opposed to just words on a page?
Ted, thank you so much for asking that question. It was a really important project to me. It happened 9 years ago, and I teach a class on translation and adaptation at American University to our graduate students. it started as a course on translation, but then I realized that some of the students weren't interested in working in other languages, but they liked the theoretical aspects of literary translation. So I added this adaptation material where I looked at how texts were transformed, like say, an example that I use in the class is John Gardner's Grendel. And so we read Beowulf, and then we read Grendel. And we ask questions about how this new view of the character Grendel adds to our impression of Beowulf in general. Has it added anything, or has it just repeated the story in a disguised way? And certainly in Gardner's novel, it adds so much. It's such a great new perspective of the outsider who's maligned, you know? So, and we talk about various translations of Beowulf, for example, and of, you know, writers from South America and, you know, all over the world, Japan and Israel. And it's a wonderful part of the course. But we talk also about how to do an adaptation oneself. And so I think I came to the idea because I wanted to try that out for the sake of my students. And I had this copybook that was written in by my great-great-grandfather between 1850 and 1860, just before the Civil War broke out. And in 1861, he fought for the Pennsylvania Regiment for a year. And then after a year, down in Warrenton, Virginia, he got really sick just before the Second Bull Run battle and went home. And he ended up being arrested a year later for desertion because something happened with his papers. His papers were falsely processed in Philadelphia, and somebody took his money and falsely processed the papers, and there was no record of his leaving the army honorably. So they came for him and took him back to Washington, D.C., and he ended up in a prison there. And it was one of the hospital prisons that Walt Whitman visited in those years that he was traveling around in DC. And I thought, wow, first of all, how interesting that Whitman may have seen my great-great-grandfather, or he might have seen Whitman. The chances are great because he was in that hospital for 8 months. And then I wrote a poem about it that ended up in another city. But then I thought, what if I took these poems that he wrote between 1850 and 1860, and some of the songs that he actually transcribed into his copybook, and made an album myself that was kind of like roots, but also an homage to the Civil War era. And I hired a bunch of musicians to join me, and AU was wonderful. They let me use their studio, and I hired a great producer to help me make the album. And in about 2 months, we put the thing together. And it really is an adaptation because it's like he wrote the lyrics and I wrote the music. There's no record of any of the music of these songs that I could find. So I had to compose the music myself and the arrangements and things. And then the other musicians came in and they helped so much. But it was a true collaboration with the dead. And it was one of the most exciting things that I've ever been a part of.
And that over just such a span of generations too. That is a remarkable story. I'm curious, is that available?
Oh yeah. You can get it on iTunes. You can get it. I mean, you can listen to the whole thing on Spotify. At this point, I think it's free. I don't know how musicians make money anymore because everything is out there to be found.
Licensing.
We'll talk about that later.
Yes, I've got a good licensing story for you. Absolutely. Okay, so a couple more quick questions before I get into just some rapid fire personal questions. Okay. Translation, you just talked about that, has been a large part of your career. From translating poetry to music to working with Carsten René Nielsen on 41 Objects and World Cut Out with Crooked Scissors, and Jan Wagner on the Art of Topiary, to requiring your students in the MFA program at American to take a class in translation, which you just talked about. So how did you originally become interested in translations of these various kinds? And I've got what role does it play in your work now, but you've addressed it a little bit, but I'll put it out
there. It plays a great role in my work because having been a translator of a German poet and a Danish poet, their work has influenced me as much as any of my earlier influences that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. Their work has gotten so into my DNA that sometimes it's shocking how much my writing has changed in the last, especially 10 years, given my work with Wagner and my work with Nielsen. So it all started about 22 years ago when I was, or 25 years ago, I was living abroad in the Czech Republic, and I went to Denmark for Christmas to visit an old friend of mine. And he had a friend named Michael who invited us over to his apartment, and we sat there on a snowy day talking about poetry. And Michael pulled a book of poems off the shelf by Carsten René Nielsen. He said, this young poet who's winning all the prizes, and began to read one of his poems about, you know, a glue factory and someone finding a tooth in the parking lot. And it was all just this extemporaneous translation, you know, in the moment. But I loved it, you know, glue factory, the tooth, the parking lot. It was all stuff that really resonated with me. And so I made a mental note to find this guy, or at least to find some of his poems in English. And of course, there were no poems in English. He had a website. It was one of those early websites, one page, you know, listing his books, and his email, but nothing. So I guess it took me a year or two to finally get in touch with him. And when I did, I asked him, are there any English versions of your work? And he said, no. Why don't we do some together? So we were only going to do 5 or 6 poems together for his website. And then I got the idea that I should send them around, see if anybody would be interested in them. And immediately, everyone I sent a poem to wanted to publish it. So I asked Carsten if he wanted to do some more. I mean, we've translated now hundreds and hundreds of poems, but it all started with that early interest in his work. And it was such an interesting process because it's so like writing, where you as the translator, you have to get out of the way. Lawrence Venuti calls it the invisibility, the translator's invisibility. You have to get out of the way so that the poet's true intention in the original language and your faithfulness to that true intention in the original language comes through in this language. Sometimes you have to change words around in order to reproduce in the new language what was happening in the old language. And that's how translation and adaptation are similar. I'm representing this old work in a way so that you will feel its power exactly as we felt it back then. If you're talking about Hamilton, Hamilton is an adaptation of a life that was, you know, groundbreaking and challenging and shocking. But, you know, 200 years later, it's not so shocking what happened to Hamilton. But, you know, when it's represented this way as a musical, we feel it again. So translation has to do that. It has to, with faith, represent what was given in the original language at any cost, whether it be the cost of the language, the form, the way it looks on the page, at any cost. And I learned that from this process. But it's like the writing process because I realized that I was also translating when I was writing my own poems, that there was a feeling that what the poem was here and I had to access that. But by the time it got to here on the page, it had already been mangled by my desire to write a poem. And so it was this lesson in getting out of the way and being invisible and allowing the poem, you know, it's back to Robert Bly, allowing the poem to, you know, to grow on its own and be free. And there is something to that. Bly was right. Letting the animal live, he said. So that was Carsten René Nielsen, and we did 4 books together. And then about 10 years ago, I started working with a German poet named Jan Wagner, who has won the Buchner Prize. And it's the big prize in Germany. It's like the Nobel of Germany. He was already a big name when I started working with him, and had been translated in England, but not in the United States. And he was so kind to do the translations with me, because I don't speak German and don't speak Danish either, by the way. But Jan and I did those translations together. And the difference with Jan's work is that he is a formal poet. So he was writing sonnets, he was writing sestinas in German. Sestina is the form where you have the repeated 6 words in different order at the end of each line of each 6 stanzas. How do you do that when you're a translator and when German grammar is different from English grammar? So we worked on that for a long time, and uses a lot of alliteration in the text, also a problem that I had to think about. But I learned so much from him and working with him. And he was so kind, and I've become very close with both of them. So there's a kind of, family feeling among the collaborations. And then that was 10 years in the making. And then the Wagner book came out in 2017. So on the one side, I had to think about how form took the center stage and how subject matter, how sometimes had to be manipulated. And on Carsten's side, because he was writing prose poems mostly, I had to think about how voice took the center stage and how the shape of the poem, or even the ways the sentences were written, had to change in order to bring across this kind of funny, jokey voice that he has in his poetry.
Okay, to wrap things up, a couple of rapid fire questions.
Yeah,
what is on your nightstand right now?
On my nightstand right now?
Yeah. I mean, literature-wise.
Literature-wise. Well, let me see. I'm sitting very close to it. I am reading, it's not poetry. I'm reading a great book from Tara Brach on mindfulness. And I'm reading it because I'm enrolled in a teaching mindfulness program as a way of kind of expanding some of my ideas about solitude and poetry. And I'm using her book too. It's called Radical Acceptance. I'm using her book to write some micro essays on that subject myself. So I don't have any poems on my desk right now.
That's okay. And what about music? What are you listening to right now that's been inspiring for you?
These rapid fire questions are tough ones. Oh, you know what? Back to the poetry. There is one book that I went very deep into because I just hosted a reading for her. It's a poet named Monica Sook, and her new book just came out from Copper Canyon. It's called A Nail the Evening Hangs On. Highly. You have it?
I have it.
Yeah, she's amazing. She was one of my students at AU 10 years ago and has since done incredible things.
We hope to get her in here actually as well.
Oh, fantastic. You will not be sorry. She's wonderful.
We're just shy of Halloween right now. So I have to ask you a Halloween-based question.
Okay.
If you have to write an ode about candy, what specific candy would it be? The fans want to know.
An ode to candy. The ode that I would write would be, you know what never gets any kind of attention is a good box of Good and Plenty. So do you know Good and Plenty?
Not really. So as far as I'm concerned, you're 100% correct.
Never gets any press time, so I'm going to go Good and Plenty. It's an old one from the 70s that I loved the most as a kid. And Circus Peanuts too, although they still have those.
Yes, they do. Well, I'll tell you what, if you write it, I promise you we'll link it on this. There's your challenge.
And Plenty.
It's so great. I love that. All right. Well, David, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time out today to talk all things poetry and specifically about your process and the ideas and inspirations that help put all this together.
It was a huge pleasure of mine, Ted. Thank you so much. And you asked fabulous questions and really got me overexcited. I don't know what I'm going to do now.